Hello again, everyone. In this video, I will talk about the nature and trends in the diplomatic activities of the European Union. To start our discussion, I would like to raise the issue the about the application of the idea of diplomacy to a regional organization, particularly with the European Union. So, when we talked about foreign policy, because as I have noted in the previous lectures that diplomacy is an instrument of foreign policy. So when we talk about foreign policy, of course we already attributed the function of foreign policy as limited only to states. To states, especially with regards to its prominent role in the international system. Thus, it begs the question of if foreign policy is limited to states, then diplomatic activities is also confined to the purview of states. However, as I have noted, our conception or our idea of diplomacy in this class is pluralistic in nature. If you remember my first lecture at the introductory session of our class, because when we talk about diplomacy, it is a function not only of states with practicing or implementing their foreign policy decisions, but it can also be attributed to other actors in the international system. So, in the case of the European Union, yes, indeed, we can apply and we can analyze the diplomatic activities of the European Union as a regional organization. And compared to other regional organizations, the European Union can be tagged or can be labeled as a not really as a special case but a successful case among other regional organizations existing in the world because so far for now the European Union is the only regional organization that has achieved a supranational nature, and by mentioning that term we are entering the this bullet that I've noted here, the practical implications. So number one is the issue of supranationalism. As I've mentioned, the European Union is known for its supranationalism, that despite differences in priorities and material interests and agendas, its member states decided to offer up or to sacrifice or let go of a partial part or a portion of their sovereignty in order for that sovereignty to be used or utilized by the regional organization to govern them in their activities, which initially started or focused on economic concerns like, for example, trade and alignment of industries, then shifted to political, and right now with the construction of the European identity. So since portions of sovereignty were sacrificed in order to create the this machine, or this entity this this entity in the international system called the European Union. The European Union is an example of supranationalism, that's of a supranational organization that is capable of conducting this what we call diplomatic activities. So in this case, the question on how to understand the creation and construction of this ability of the European Union to conduct diplomatic activities has something to do with the issue of institutionalization. So what is institutionalization? It's what? As I've said earlier or in the previous lectures, when we talk about international institutions, we can refer to formal or informal international institutions, and that the very existence of these institutions govern and constrain the behavior and freedom of the actors that decided to be under this institution. And by that logic, we can say that being constrained or having limited freedom by being constrained or the freedom being limited by the institution, it is a voluntary activity. Always note that this is a voluntary activity that the member states or the actors that decide to be under that institution consented to be constrained and to be limited in terms of their activities. So in that case, how can we understand the institutionalization of this diplomatic function of the European Union? Of course, there is what? The establishment of formal institutions inside the regional organizational setup of the European Union, which I will expound in the upcoming slide later. Okay, that is the first practical implication that we need to account in understanding the European Union diplomatic activities. Second is the alignment and the harmonization of foreign policy priorities. So as I've said in the earlier discussion, member states decided to give up a part of their sovereignty in order for them to be governed by a supranational regional organization, which is their own creation, which is the EU. So by being member states that have consented to be governed by this organization, which is, we can say that it's an artificial entity, but because of their consent, it became an institution. So once that this institution implemented a certain rule or parameter on how to conduct diplomatic activities, here comes the issue of how do states align and harmonize their foreign policy priorities based on the regional priorities outlined by the European Union, which is the organization that governs or regulates them. Of course, this alignment and harmonization of foreign policy priorities is an event or a phenomenon that is always not occurring in a smooth manner. Of course, because each state, each member state has their own agenda, self-interest. There's this presence of disagreement that's again pushing these states to have conflict inside the regional organization. And fortunately, the compared to other regional organizations around the world, the European Union has installed its own sub-institutions to tackle those conflicts. So some good examples is, for example, the role of Germany in modern day Europe, wherein there's a debate whether who shall lead the European civilization. So I think that was a decade before, prior to 2010. I think there was a conflict whether it will be. I mean, it's not really a contest, but there are fears around Europe that Germany will dominate the whole European continent, particularly the Western European region, that France has been very willing to check its growth or its increasing dominance in terms of military and economic capabilities. So that's one example. And then the recent event wherein the United Kingdom decided to not retract, but the United Kingdom decided to withdraw their membership in the European Union, as manifested in this so-called Brexit because of, yeah, as I've said, conflict of their interest towards, I mean, conflict of interest and non-alignment of agenda as dictated by the European Union, and with the agendas and interests being espoused or concerned, wherein these states are concerned with. So, in order to understand the EU foreign policy and diplomatic activities, we need to look at the institutions involved inside the regional organizations. As I have mentioned before, we have two types or two categories of institutions. Formal international institutions, on the other hand, is informal international institutions. When we talk about informal, take note, when we talk about informal international institutions, we refer to those um, institutions like practices, norms that don't have a legal and official basis, but by the very existence themselves, they constrain, limit, and their very existence are considered by the states in order for them to develop their next move. On the other hand, when we talk about formal international institutions, we are talking about those institutions that have a legal and official character. And thankfully, compared to other regional organizations that have very fluid and abstract ideas that govern their activities. For example, in ASEAN, they have this what we call ASEAN Way. In terms of the because in ASEAN Way is not an institutionalized concept, but those are list of ideas on how to deal with regional issues. So in that case, it's very kumbaga if you are an actor, it's very difficult to maneuver what will be your next action or how to predict the action of the other actors. So in the case of the European Union, well, at least in the case of the European Union, there are explicit formal institutions that we can consider as we analyze. And I think, and I really suggest that if you want, especially for European studies majors, that if you want to conduct a research about the foreign policy or diplomatic activities of the European Union, one good thing to consult first as you develop your topic is to look on these legal institutions and administrative institutions that are present, because this will serve as your what by knowing these legal and administrative institutions, you will see what are the limits and what are the possible actions that a certain actor that you want to study, that what are the actions that they can avail. So for example, if you want to study the participation of a certain European member state inside the politics of European Union, so you look on the legal institutions. Or if you want to study the role of multinational corporations in policy making or diplomatic activities of EU in general, you can look on these legalities or these treaties agreements or to determine, okay, on what channels these multinational corporations or even NGOs or faith-based organizations can participate in the policy making or decision making in general of the European Union as an organization as a whole. So yeah, so you first look on those parameters dictated by these institutions and their functions, so that if you discover the institutional and contextual background of the topic that you want to explore. For example, if you want to write a term paper, a research, or a thesis, it will substantiate and it will give your topic, or it will enable you to narrow down your topic to a more specific focus. And that is one of the key avenues or key techniques to improve your research proposal. So here are the legal institutions. For example, you have now the first one, the Single European Act of 1986, which is the first document that explicitly noted about the political integration of the European Union, which means alignment in terms of political priorities by the member states of the organization. You have the 1991 Maastricht Treaty that established the framework for member states having a common foreign and security policy. Therefore, since they are signatories and members of the European Union, the member states are required to adopt and align their foreign and security policies based on the points outlined by the Maastricht Treaty. Same with the treaties of Amsterdam, and I'm not sure if it's read as nice or Nietzsche, or I don't know. Just check. And then 2009 Lisbon Treaty, which affirmed that there must be a community diplomacy. I mean that it called or rallied for a more aligned diplomatic priorities and agenda by the member states so that the European Union will have a coherent approach towards global issues or towards target partners. And then, yeah, as I have said, you need to know what are the allowed and prohibited diplomatic activities by checking the contents of these legal institutions or parameters that guides the conduct of European Union diplomacy. Okay, with us, consequently, these legal institutions also led to the creation of these official administrative institutions that are concerned with the diplomatic activities of the European Union. So there's this creation of the High Representative of the EEAS or the European External Action Service, the creation of the semi-permanent president of the European Council, additional functions for the EU Commission, and these functions obviously is related to diplomatic activities, the creation of different special representatives. And then the last one, the last implication that I have noted here is that, yeah, because of the implementation of the agreements that we discussed earlier, it created a multi-layered and a multi-institutional diplomacy wherein there's this EEAS, which is the European External Action Service. This is, well, usually it's the analogy is that the EEAS serves as the counterpart or the regional Ministry of Foreign Affairs. However, that's a very simplistic categorization because, as I have said, um, European Union foreign policy and diplomatic activities is multi-institutional. So the EEAS does not have the sole power to guide and to implement diplomatic action. It is shared with the other existing European Union institutions like the European Council, the Commission, and the existence of other special representatives created. Okay, another implication is this one, the existence of the EEAS and its overlap with the national embassies. So despite that there's this coherent approach to diplomatic affairs, implemented by the European Union, member states are still allowed to have their own national embassies stationed towards their partner countries. So I would like to cite the example of the Philippines. So if you will notice, of course, the European member countries, the EU member countries have their own national embassies here in the Philippines. You have you have the Italian embassy, the Spanish embassy, the French embassy, yeah, those embassies from Europe. However, the European Union has its own diplomatic representation here in the Philippines that is actually also part of the what we call diplomatic corps. The diplomatic corps, which is a community of representatives, of national representatives and ambassadors, that is usually pag may event in if there's an event, a national event here in the Philippines, like in Malacanang or during the SONAS, the state of the nation addresses in the Congress, they are actually present. And in the case of the Philippines, the head of the diplomatic corps, which is consisted by different representatives and ambassadors from other countries, is the Apostolic Nuncio, the ambassador sent by the Vatican here in the Philippines. So going back, despite that there are national embassies stationed here from different member states of the European Union, we still have what? We still have this office called the Union Delegation here in the Philippines, and it is a different office that coordinates again. Yeah, it coordinates the office, the EU delegation, coordinates with the national embassies stationed in a specific country or a partner country of the European Union member states. So what is the function of the EU delegation? There actually, as I have said, there's this overlap with the national embassies, except with, of course, with the consular concerns like visas, because visas are the responsibility and power. I mean, granting a visa towards specific um, a specific person applying to be admitted inside the territory with is dependent towards the or it's a privilege granted by the country that will accept that applicant. So yeah, so that's the case for national embassies, although there's an exemption, for example, with Schengen visa that allows you to have a mobility inside the whole Europe. So aside from that, the EU delegation also conducts political affairs and economic affairs, some of them discreetly. So for example, if there's a multinational corporation which is based in the EU and this multinational corporation is at a disadvantaged position in a country, in a partner country, the EU delegation can file a protest or can send, kasi if filing a protest, it's very antagonistic. So there are cases that the EU delegation can send a letter or issue a statement. So the EU delegation can serve as a key opinion leader with, with regards to those economic policies that were in the concerned MNCs being disadvantaged. So that's an example. So yeah, flexible and overlapping with the functions of national embassies.